Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday. Like I said, my name is Chris, and I, along with Joey Molina, who's also hiding in the event, we make up Discrit, and we're a little organization here in Atlanta that sponsors and produces free public art education programming. So we sponsor things like lectures, screenings, workshops, panels, you name it. And I'm so happy to say that we are sponsoring Julia today. Julia is going to introduce herself to you guys in more detail, but I just want to welcome all of you to the event. Thank you to Atlanta Contemporary for sponsoring us, and a big thank you to Julia for the tremendous amount of work that she put into this very creative and novel event. So Julia, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Chris, for the introduction. Thank you to Atlanta Contemporary for inviting me to do this part lecture, part performance event. I'm really excited for today. And I should also thank the duo of Discrit. So Chris Fernald and Joey Molina. You guys were incredibly supportive in my planning of this event. And I think that this enables a certain type of encounter with Benjamin Patterson's work that is necessary. It's so personalized beyond the museum. But before we begin with the program today, I'm going to read through a script as we go along. I want to outline the event's structure. And so after sharing these details, we will move into a performance. Yes, we will move into a performance that will then be followed by lectures that either thematically or historically ground Patterson and his art, and performance art sessions here, okay? So this explanation should really blunt some or hopefully all of the anxiety that you may have with individually performing in public. So performance study, Benjamin Patterson, 2020. Let's go. This is organized by 4 lecture portions and 5 performances, which will occur in sequence with one another. Each lecture portion lasts for about 13 minutes, and each performance lasts between 10 to 15 minutes total. And we'll move from lecture to performance and so forth. When a lecture concludes, that's when we'll initiate a performance session, first with an introduction to the piece that I will provide, and then give you guys some preparatory time to figure out how you will enact it, as well as time to perform it, and just like a general Q&A to follow each one. Each performance section really is necessary because most of Patterson's work in the early period occur in the format of event scores. So they are these short typewritten directions typically, but his event scores are quite elaborate. And as we go through, I'll actually clarify the amount of time that you have allotted for performances. But what I'm most interested in with this event is how Patterson his works relate directly to experience. Okay, so what are some of your initial impressions in the process of performing them? What are your questions, your concerns, your critiques? What are some of the discourses that come to mind? How does it feel to perform them? Although the narrative of Ben Patterson and his significance to art is increasing, much about the reception is lost. Part of that is because it's highly personalized. I do understand that some attendees might not want to perform live on Zoom. And while I strongly encourage you to do so, I am requesting then the following etiquette. If you're not performing during these sections, please keep your mic muted and your video off. That just is to enable some lack of distraction in the preparation for other people. His performances, though, invite and even sometimes encourage private enactment. So it may be that you perform the works that we have on view paper piece, for example, with your screen off. And the only work that actually requires some additional preparation in terms of materials that you may want to think about in advance is paper piece. And that's actually work that's going to conclude all of our performances. And it asks for you to gather different variations of paper to rip and to bust apart over the duration of the work. So if you have not gathered those materials already, make sure to do so. And in advance of all of the performances, I'm actually going to drop a very important file into the chat that collects all of the performances to be used today. Therefore, you don't always have to resort to my screen. So it's going to take a quick second for me to transition to the chat and drop the link. It will be uploading. You can always refer to this alongside the Zoom. And that's actually quite useful because these are reproductions of Patterson's work that he republished in 1999. So back to my keynote lecture and hit play. And in terms of how this event will unfold, please note that I really do have to rely on some assistance from other people. If there is a lot of activity in the chat box, that's just something I can't manage. So it may be that if you have a question over the course of the event, that it'll happen towards the end, or it will happen sometime after each performance session. Any questions, please hold them till then, either the performance sessions or for the end, okay? So with that, I'd actually like to begin the lecture of Performance Study, Benjamin Patterson, and also offer a little bit of self-introduction. This performance study was designed to introduce or even reintroduce you to Benjamin Patterson, often going by Ben Patterson, his career, his conceptual and aesthetic contributions to art making, while foregrounding context, okay? Context, which is central to the historical and aesthetic encounters of his work, that in some ways resists overprivileging the recorded image and the recorded video that is most common to witnessing performance in the performance art event. So it's actually heartening to see continued interest in Ben Patterson. Thank you for being here. His rise and his reemergence was cut short, unfortunately, by his passing in 2016. So Ben Anthony Patterson Jr. was born in 1934 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He entered art history through an association with Fluxus, new music, and iconic experimentations across media and performance. Fluxus, this mid-century international group of musicians, poets, artists, and creatives more broadly, developed alternative approaches and attitudes to the creative process and challenges to establish definitions of art, its form, its function, as well as destabilizing art establishment values. Patterson was a key figure of this phenomenon, counting as a co-founder among many other co-founders, similar to individuals like Lithuanian-born George Mačiūnas, the often described quote-unquote founder of Fluxus, as well as Namjoon Paik, the father of video art, for example, Alison Knowles, Dick Higgins, among many others. Derived from Latin by Mačiūnas, Fluxus carries the meaning of flow and fluctuation, which avails an ideological embrace of destabilization, of a multiplicity of meaning and decentralization. So think about Fluxus and to flow. A common refrain in Fluxus history is that it was born in Wiesbaden in 1962 at the Internationale Festspiele Neuester Musik, so the International Festival of Newest Music in Wiesbaden. And Patterson, he was present both as an organizer and a performer of Fluxus during this proto-history. Its classical years, as well as what some would say after the death of Maciunas in 1978. So there are three very interesting periods of the Fluxus art historical phenomenon: before 1962, 1962 to 1965, and then after 1978-ish. So Patterson's arrival to Fluxus serves as the major reference in contemporary conversations of him and his work. He is an African-American, classically trained contrabassist who ended up squarely enmeshed in alternative and provocative arguments for post-war art. And this discourse is keen on his exceptionalism, and it has actually yet to wear off in how we still discuss his significance. His position, though, as an African-American musician to and through Fluxus is certainly remarkable, especially when we consider his oppositional stance. So over the course of 46 years, Patterson embraced modes of art making defiant to and distrustful of institutions that promoted and protected hierarchies as well as standards of taste and value. He experienced in his young adulthood and childhood de facto segregation and the legislated separation of society based upon these racist notions of biology. They deeply impacted him. And so he actually perceived in segregation this imaginary racist doctrine. And it was a doctrine that nevertheless generated real barriers for opportunity for him and others, in addition to furnishing what is a limited sense of the vastness of contemporary art, if we are delineating who is and who is not valid. But at the end of the 1950s, Patterson began questioning another set of boundaries, this time between the fine arts as man-made, as artificially manufactured by privileged elites for personal consumption, the parallels between segregation as a social institution and the fine arts as a cultural institution in the United States compelled him to develop opposing aesthetic sensibilities invested in self-definition and personal agency. And he addressed the problematics of his social and visual worlds by utilizing art to rethink and displace loaded histories. For Patterson, art was at best an experimental mechanism for perpetual discovery. So in regard to anti-authoritarian and integrationist attitudes, this is such a beautiful picture of him moving and jumping and leaping over something. During the post-war 60s, Patterson's middle-class and African-American background distinguished him as the only African-American artist in Fluxus. He was never involved with any majority Black visual art group, such as Spiral, Afrocobra, or even like Way You See Arts Collective, whose own ideas also saw art as a tool for liberation. Therefore, Patterson's singularity is notable, but I do want to caution against its centrality because citation of Patterson as the only African-American artist in Fluxus necessarily validates one argument of Fluxus as an official membered group amid ongoing conversations now that is unsettling who is and is not Fluxus, and Fluxus's own myriad existential forms as a group, as a movement, as an anti-movement, as the avant-garde, as the rear guard. So in addition, it risks decentering a number of other individuals within Patterson's conceptual orbit. So my research then contends that Patterson and his art approach is not only attributable to Fluxus. And so this consideration of Patterson that privileges Fluxus provides a type of continuity that I'm trying to break up. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead because I do think I have about 1 more minute before I would like for you guys to jump into your first performance, which I will prep you for. I want to introduce myself a little bit more. I have a dissertation that I'm working on titled Who Taught You to Think Like That? Benjamin Patterson's Conceptual Aesthetic. And in it, I argue that he constructed an aesthetic sensibility towards art that prioritized process and method because his interest in destabilizing normalized assumptions about art relied on training oneself in one's perceptions of art. So this aesthetic sensibility is predominantly conceptual. It's built from an interdisciplinary attention to music, to pedagogy, games, and performance. While one might argue that Patterson's investment in concrete and stylized objects as art from the 1980s onwards might undermine this premise, I actually regard his late incorporation of them as renewing a practice of appropriation through which he is juxtaposing materials to narrativize Fluxus or bear upon political and epistemological absurdities. And so over the course of his entire career, Patterson enlisted materials that were replete with metaphorical and performative significance, which I make evident in my exploration of how he treats objects ranging from double bases to paper, food items, print materials, and toys. Ready-mades, reuse, retitling, reperformance, reworking are his choice methods. And so consideration of this relationship between the material and the method in his oeuvre not only outlines ways for understanding his works that are obscured by form, but also insists that his conceptual aesthetic is an extended meditation on cognitive and material rediscovery. Okay, and so this is where I'm actually going to conclude and try to transition into the performance because we are running on time. So we're going to actually conduct a self-guided work by Ben Patterson, which is a questionnaire. It is called How the Average Person Thinks About Art. And so I'm opening that master document and sharing my screen with you guys. Okay, zoom it over. Show of hands if you can see the how the average person thinks about art image. Perfect. Okay, and so what this, I'll break down the paragraph for you. Essentially, he has organized a series of prompts for you to answer on the following pages. And it's about information sourcing and finding, which I also think, especially in 1983, is important for art historians to tap into when it comes to actually trying to gauge the reception to his work. What you're asked to do is fill out the information, height, weight, age, and sex. But then you have these little sections numbered 1 through 28. And on it, you use a scale of 6, 4, 3, and 1 to rank what is most like you and what is least like you, with 1 being least like you. Ben asks in the conducting of this work for you to mail it to him. He is no longer with us. If you would like to share it with the chat, that would be great. If you would like to email me, can somebody put in my UT email address into the chat? Or you could also email Atlanta Contemporary. We have to keep in mind that Ben was really intrigued in the individual who attends the art event, asking who they are before we think about sort of the 1990s and 21st century reflection and centering the participant or the audience member. So I am going to try to break this up. Look at the gallery room. And I'm going to give you guys about, it is 12:26. I am going to give you guys about 2 minutes to prepare if you'd like to read through the questions even further. And then 5 minutes to answer the questions. And you can always complete these after we move into another lecture. And yes, I have actually filled out my own questionnaire.
Could you read it out loud or put it back on the screen? I'm not seeing it.
Okay. So besides that explanation I give, okay, there we go. Patterson says, we seek the average person. This is underscored. What is your height, your weight, your age, your sex, the color of your eyes, the color of hair, birthplace, monthly income, total debts, number of visits per month to art exhibits, concerts, or theater, marital status, married, single, divorce. And then on the next page, we have, when discussing, okay, I accidentally messed this up. Give me 1 second. So when discussing art, I am likely to impress others as 1, critical and to the point, 2, emotional and somewhat stimulating, 3, astute and logical, 4, intellectually oriented and somewhat complex. And I think given the time, I will mention one other. In communicating with others about art, I may 9, express unintended boredom with talk that is too detailed. 10, convey impatience with those who express ideas that are obviously not thought through. 11, show little interest in thoughts and ideas that show little or no originality. 12, tend to ignore those who talk about long-range implications and direct my attention to the significance right now. All right, so we have about 1 more minute for that. Where is cute? There we go. This will be a work that we obviously do not have a general discussion with after the fact. In about 30 seconds, I will continue the lecture. 6 is the most. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I had the chat up this time. Perfect. Patterson wants you to sit with his work. That's a very particular demand. Okay. So I will continue with the lecture now. Okay, so left. Notably, some of Patterson's most iconic performances are framed by few photographs and forms of other historical documents. And, you know, this is a problem that's best represented within a set of 7 gelatin silver prints in 1962 of variations for double bass, which he created in 1961. This is a work that's frequently republished. Institutions either identify these images as representing two performances that they do not explicitly delineate between duo for voice and a string instrument from 61 and variations for double bass in 1961, or they mask the real-time succession of performance after performance, thus leaving a work such as duo for voice and a string instrument unstated. Some websites have presently updated this, realizing that another person is standing on the stage with Benjamin Patterson in the upper right photograph that you see here. So, in addition to Patterson and his involvement with Fluxus, he really carried Fluxus's rejection of originality and originals outstandingly, to the point that my research has uncovered numerous versions upon versions of under original titles, word-for-word copies, and altered formats, and individual and original works that share the same title, okay? You will see a couple versions of that as we go through, but we are sticking to just a handful of some images. I'm transitioning to a focus in my lecture now on Ben Patterson and his conceptual ideas. So, in 1964, Patterson wrote a confession and an acknowledgement about his work and goals in a short essay published in German under the title Bekenntnis. On November 14th, he remarked, "I confess, my work says nothing. I have disregarded this artist's traditional duty and have followed the program of an education. My intention was not to produce, quote unquote, art. I have not cooperated with this circle. In my work, the consumer does not find perfect ideas that require him to search for the beautiful and authentic, to determine, to create, or to be inspected and approved. I am guilty of do-it-yourselfism. I have demanded from an experience not a passive observer or a listener, to insert his person as performer, interpreter, and even as creator in and the event, okay? I have not been occupied with stimulating retinas or eardrums. Rather, I have planned to consider the skills responsible for integral experience. I am obsessed with training and experience." Patterson's interest in training and practice must be emphasized. By 1964, he already presented a number of key works to his conceptual practice and of lasting interest to contemporary artists such as Howardina Pindell and Clifford Owens. Patterson heavily valued earlier manifestations of what would form Fluxus, also noting that its quote-unquote beginning or pre-Fluxus years between 1958 to 1962 was, quote, "the most interesting aspect of Fluxus," end quote. During this time, he created about 22 out of 32 works before he established some distance between himself and Fluxus activities in the mid-60s. These works, ranging from acoustic, material, and performative interests, built a practice in search of a conceptual framework for assessing human perception. His disinterest in this stimulation of eyes and retinas, of eye drums, suggestively resists, or at the very least, de-emphasizes the significance of music, sonic inquiry, and the visual in this journey. But it's something I do contend with. The visual is quite important. For example, Ants from 1960 offers some clues into how he more complicatedly approached content informed through chance inquiry. While visiting a park in Dusseldorf and carrying a lone camera, Patterson captured 8 photographs of ants crawling on the ground. These photographs, which are glossy, were printed roughly in the size of 8x8 squares. He copied the results of these photographed ants onto paper with the aims to generate an aleatoric music performance, or music that relinquished sections of a composition or its performance to chance. His performance subsequently ended in what he called disappointing music, and in his estimation. But he would actually later note that in this example, in this trying out of image and sound, he discovered method instead. And so at the inception of Patterson's proto-Fluxus works, method was defined through an approach that incorporated multimedia in the act of discovery, drawing on encounters that dissolve the boundaries between an art experience and the everyday, as this questionnaire sort of illustrates. So if we return to a work such as Variations for Double Bass, perhaps his most iconic performance today, we may also glean how it functions simultaneously as a sonic exploration and as a trial of training and practice for a classically educated musician turned experimental artist. Across all photographs, Variation for Double Bass reflects Patterson's willful rejection of musical conventions, mediated by his position as an African-American musician and foreign artist who is absorbed in the physical and sonic relationships between everyday objects and how to utilize them in the production of an innovative ways of experiencing the world through sight and sound. You see this double bass tossed and turned upon its neck, okay? His process of revealing concealed potentials within charged emblems of culture and banal objects essentially offers a reprisal to this criticism that the culture industry is such that there is no alert consumption. So to clarify just a bit here, Variation for Double Bass actually enlists of the performer to enact a series of actions on the double bass, making music with the strings, with string, actually separate string from the bass, with clips, with frogs, with fans blowing in through the F hole and so forth. And so Patterson is awkwardly positioned in front of an audience, this time in Cologne, but in the next image, this is actually the most popular reference. He is cacophonously plucking the strings of a double bass with outlandish and inappropriate objects to what would have been or what would have been desired of a classical music performance. And so, in a matter of minutes, he really undermines the instrumentality and given function of the bass when he flips it on its neck or when he continues playing it with odd objects. And so by situating this instrument in the realm of non-music, and what is retrospectively labeled as quote unquote performance art, he's shattering normative gazes by onlookers and insists upon a deeper understanding of the reality before himself and before them. So it's important to note that Patterson performed this work multiple times over the course of 2 years. The occurrence that's most accessible is the one that you are looking at, and it was paired quite specifically with duo for voice and a string instrument with avant-garde vocalist and African-American opera singer William Pearson. They also performed together in 1961, and Patterson routinely only performed this work, interestingly enough, with Black musicians. On June 9th, 1962, he re-performed Variations for Double Bass for the evening opening of Kleines Sommerfest, après John Cage at Gallery Parnasse in Wuppertal, which was a private gallery founded by Wolf and Annelies Jährling as one of the leading meeting points of the avant-garde and post-war German art in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia. The small summer festival's opening occurred on occasion of an abstract painting exhibition at the gallery, which established itself after its founding in 1949 as a major site for art informel. At this time that Patterson restaged his work, and more broadly between 62 and 65, Gallery Parnasse was also an important forum for proto-Fluxus activity. According to Fluxus art historian Owen F. Smith, whose Fluxus, The History of an Attitude, deeply charted its historical contours, June 9th was the first public manifestation related to Fluxus. Not featured here on the, there's also an invitation card with scrawls of handwritten additions for the program that suggests that Variations for Bass was third in line to occur, second only after Duo made in 1961. But more remarkably, it's actually been Patterson's whose performances follow the first event when George Maciunas' lecture draft, titled Neo-Dada in Music, Theater, Poetry, and Art, was read aloud in German by Artus C. Kaspari. In this lecture, Maciunas, who contextualized works for that night in terms of opposition and concretism, said that these quote-unquote anti-art works departed from the professionalism of fine art and the, quote, artificial world of abstraction, end quote. They were unbound to medium or genre in pursuit of time-based action and sound, leading to him to proclaim something such as anti-art is life. Maciunas' defining lecture inaugurated the event, but most immediately grounded Patterson's performance in a context of defiance. His performance of variations for double bass that evening contributed profoundly, even if unintentionally, to the foundation upon which Fluxus and its sensibilities are historicized, and it has simultaneously resulted in iconic images central to the ongoing recovery of his lasting impact. To Fluxus, to performance, and to conceptual art practices. He linked discovery as this ongoing process of awareness with developing his interest in human perception. Wiesbaden, this other site that happened later in 1962 as for birthing Fluxus, was also a significant location. And, Patterson, he launched investigations into perception from experimentations between sound and oral experience, the literary, its relationship to the everyday, the performing body, its relationship to embodied experience. And so as such, ephemeral live action in the human body often implicitly presumed an idealized able body, for one, but they are also mainstays in every mode of Patterson's inquiries before the 1980s. And so I'm actually going to pause here to interject a performance as we need a very interesting and homemade example of, why can't I see my cursor? A homemade example of how his work blends art with the everyday. This is A Very Lawful Dance for Innes, and it is a performance I strongly encourage everybody to perform. Before I scroll to it, I am going to gander in chat because I would also like to witness it. A Very Lawful Dance, can everybody see it? Right.
Yes.
Thank you. A Very Lawful Dance is an event score this time, typewritten directions, where you are required to find a traffic light. I'll read it out loud. Find a traffic light with or without special pedestrian signals, is found or positioned on street corner or at stage center. Performers wait at real or imaginary curb on red signal, alerts self on yellow signal, crosses street or stage on green signal. Achieving opposite side, performer turns and repeats the sequence. A performance may consist of an indefinite, indeterminate, or predetermined number of repetitions. So what this is asking you to do is continually cross within the guidance of a traffic signal. And I have that traffic signal. How many, if people are performing this without video, can you raise your hand so I can have some excitement? Okay, so let me say that we really don't need any additional preparation for the work. You just have to find a location somewhere in your house, somewhere wherever you are, to perform, somewhere where there is an intersection. I will need somebody to holler at me because I am also performing. I am sharing the traffic signal. When I hit play, you have to follow the directions. Uh-oh. Share screen. and then go to it. There we go. On the count of 10, we're going to perform a very lawful dance for Ennis, named for his firstborn son. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Are you going to cross with me, Renee? This will be the last go through. Two, one. For those who participated, could you release your mic? Can you open it up so we could just have maybe a good, I ran up a set of stairs. So we could have a bit of a follow through on just what exactly happened. Ooh, I am out of shape. What are some of the thoughts that come to your mind performing something like this? Performing a work that seems to already be what you might do in your day-to-day.
For me, it was about like anticipation. And maybe it's because I'm, sitting here looking at the timer. But it's interesting that this offers like a literal go to a street and find it versus like an imaginary framing of it. So being in the bedroom here that I'm in, and as I'm doing it, I'm just thinking of like, oh, well, okay, this is me pacing in my room. Like, am I nervous? I don't know. So it was just interesting to all the thoughts that I was having while it was occurring. But it also made me think of like that crosswalk as like active like intersection. So it's constantly like in flow.
Joey, you said anticipation, and my thought was like anxiety, which I guess is kind of like the same vein, but for me, like the anxiety of like not knowing when I should be crossing the threshold, not knowing if the pace that I was going was also the pace of everyone else crossing that threshold, and being very aware of this isolated performance that was also happening in other spaces, and just that being very weird for me. That's all.
Maggie mentioned, Maggie Roseno, there is a metacognitive awareness of one's body movements, anticipated movements, posture, timing, etc.
Yeah, I also added in the chat, I was, highly aware of, this is a very like ordinary action, but there was this like extra weight attached to it in my mind because of the context in which we were doing it. And that it had these sort of quotations of art around it. And so that was one pressure I noticed. And then the other was, with our Zoom situation, thinking about the pressure of the camera and what expectations I felt of, as far as like entertainment or originality, being in front of an audience and holding attention. So I noticed myself like feeling pressure to mix up the way I was moving across the screen. I also noticed, Kirsten, I'm not sure I think you were doing it with us as well, but you, I think, had a very interesting choice that I didn't see anyone else do, which was you brought the camera with you. And whereas the rest of us kind of approached it as like a very two-dimensional thing that we moved across. So I thought that was a really cool choice.
That just was me being present in who we are in society. Like even in a performative space, I feel like a phone is going to be there or some type of visual aid so that you are there in the moment with the performer versus necessarily observing them directly.
Maggie added, the collective experience here felt musical. I was surprised by this.
On the sort of audience side, because I was sitting watching, trying to get a good screenshot of people doing the performance, it was kind of interesting being on the outside, like especially too, as you mentioned, Chris, like watching everyone go like kind of off frame. Felt like when, actors on a stage go into the wings of the stage and the platform, and you just kind of wonder, like, what's happening to that person when they step out of frame? Are they out of character or do they stay in character? And that kind of idea of, what happens to the performer when they go out of view versus in view is kind of an interesting thought that crossed my mind.
And that's I think that's such an interesting comment in a way too, Abby, because, with Ben's work and the work of his peers, and Julia, you can speak to this, I'm sure, with people working in Fluxus and Fluxus adjacent modalities, there was always this tension about where art begins and ends situationally. And so within his original instructions and his suggestion of setting being a public place, that's really felt. But it's interesting how when we translate that to Zoom, it's still that confusion still carries, and you could still kind of get that, the potentially like limiting framework of the camera could still sort of elicit that in a way, because it evoked in you this theatrical metaphor and that question of where does performance end and begin. And I want to call attention, Nathaniel left a comment. I don't have much to add, but it made me feel kind of silly in a good way. It made me think about doing this in everyday life. And also when I reached the other side of the room with more time on green light, I thought, oh, what do I do now? Should I keep going or wait? Yeah, I felt that too. like the pressure to make, I think at one point I made a couple crossings in the middle of the time.
Yeah. I went up and down the staircase, if you guys couldn't hear, and my dogs also joined me. You know, what I'm hearing across all these responses to the performance is some anxiety around the boundaries of action and how the gaze might also exacerbate or affect those anxieties. I mean, I jaywalk everywhere in the US. I believe in pedestrian rights and so forth. I believe in an urban area that's designed for human scale, but I don't jaywalk in Germany. In fact, I wait for the signals to cross, and I am mortified when I see people in Germany do that. I was like, they must be foreign because they're not following these directions. But even if we think about some of the context of traffic signals, they are disciplining features, right? They are structured in a way to control the flow of traffic, human traffic, so that cars may pass or not kill you. And, you know, so there are two moments that I might actually share hearing these responses, in which one person performed a very lawful dance, and Patterson reperformed it in Stuttgart sometime in like 2012 or so. But Dick Higgins, he's an important figure to Fluxus. He founded Something Else Press, and Patterson had submitted some things to him. And his recollections of A Very Lawful Dance, he said he decided to just take it up on a whim with a bunch of other hookers. Okay, so there's problematic terminology in Times Square, where eventually so many people caught on to the phenomenon of people crossing that everyone joined in, and it was like this. What do you call those things where people like just show up and start dancing together? Flash mob. Thank you. It was like a flash mob. And then when Patterson reperformed it again in the 21st century, you know, everybody was curious about the historical context and so forth. What's going on? What do we do? And he says, we cross the street. And that is it. He doesn't over-explain his work to people because he's far more invested in their own perceptions of it. And that invites a certain type of failure as well, a certain type of monotony, a certain type of boringness. Who cares about crossing a street if you live somewhere where streets aren't accessible infrastructure for whatever kind of reason? And so with that, go ahead.
Yeah. So it brought up a lot of things for me. One thing that I haven't heard at all. So I guess like kind of narrating a little bit, I would think it kind of brought me back to kind of Cold War idea, radar, and like the red light, like and with the threat of trumping when he's in office. So like kind of nuclear annihilation and whatnot. That was one thing that was striking, and like the idea of entrainment. These lights are going, and like how that's used in different ways, like looking in a fire and whatnot, and then also just like you mentioned the control of how like a light works to monitor traffic and things like that. So even just kind of like with imagination or actualized or a different way, like with the instructions, like how with education in different ways we're given instructions. So like it almost seemed like one had to kind of bring it out to the street. So how does that work in the mind in terms of if you think you have to bring it out to the street to do this, as opposed to tweaking it to be in your space, and what did all that mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things we can consistently encounter in Patterson's work is that even in his elaboration of specific directions, he often leaves much to the imagination. And so even though that there are some typical ways of scaffolding the performance with materials, whether it's on a stage or whether it's outside, he still relinquishes that sort of determination, really sort of calling forth this investment Fluxus has with indeterminacy and with meaning being something that fluctuates. Although I would admit that over the course of some moments in Patterson's work, authorship is actually quite important. And we could talk about that later during the general Q&A. And we can also or maybe I can add a bit more commentary related to noticeable militaristic undertones in his work, because that's not the only piece. There are a couple that we'll see going forward. So what I eventually argue, though, even though Fluxus is quite central, please feel free to ask me why I'm arguing this. I describe Patterson's conceptual aesthetic as an approach to art making that deconstructs meaning, that invests in dematerialization, that's far more invested in process. Some of these are key terms and words associated with conceptual art, conceptualism, and concept art during the 1960s. But he was really interested in generating a strong motive for creating work as how one pleases. So without these strictures of commissions or any kind of intent to profit. Few Fluxus artists profited on their work in the early 1960s, and few still do today. And so if we think of Fluxus as this thing that is this phenomena that has different sort of discursive elements, Ben Patterson is a Fluxus artist, but his aesthetic is not tied solely to what Fluxus is. It's tied to a blending of music, sculpture, his own experiences, both in the art world outside of it, abroad in the United States, and so forth. And Fluxus was really this visual laboratory for his self-expression. And, you know, Patterson often issues statements that Fluxus's openness was actually quite crucial to his resistance of normativity. That improvisation and adaptability were serviceable methods that provided endless cognitive cleanses. And so, you know, we might also think about improvisation and adaptability as relevant strategies to address tangible socio-political conditions that impacted him. He was a middle-class, college-educated Black Pittsburghian who his lucid encounters with structural racism essentially contradicted the freedom of opportunity that was espoused within and by the United States. And so that the United States was this, place that touted ideals of democracy locally and internationally amid its own divisive racial politics is an important lens for his history and art. Another country, Germany, serves as a major post-war site that renders legible the absurdity of his birthplace and the extent of his own adaptability. And so in my exploration of his training and practice, I highlight how his extraction of this anti-authoritarian sensibility from post-war electronic music and from Fluxus and from Nouveau Realisme and so forth accelerated his own yet often overlooked practice of unpacking perceptions and value systems. Okay. And so the year after Patterson published Bekenntnis and Wolf Fostel and Jürgen Becker's Happenings, Fluxus, Pop Art, Nouveau Realisme, eine Dokumentation, he wrote what is arguably the most significant theoretical treatise of his work and his conceptual approach to it in 1965, in which he explores the social and cultural function of art and artists. That year, Patterson submitted notes on pets as one of his entries to the Four Suits on the right, this anthology which fellow Fluxus artist, as I mentioned, Dick Higgins, published through Something Else Press. And so Patterson's treatise on perception education tools, PETS, was also published alongside works by Alison Knowles, Philip Corner, Thomas Schmidt, and other works by him, including Seminar, that you see here, and an appendix for Methods and Processes. According to Patterson, the function of the artist in society is dual. Artists operate as both discoverers and educators. Otherwise, they would just be mere producers of aesthetic objects. And he views the creative results of their actions or their artworks foremost as an educational tool, and secondly, as an aesthetic object. And he arrived at this argument by articulating the art encounter in the modern era as an activity of education, if this format of a lecture and performance doesn't seem as if it's also pursuing something similar. So, the artwork is essentially standing between an observer and of a subject or an idea that's envisioned by the artist, and the artist cites methods for communication that develop in parallel to the stylistic changes across art periods or within the work that they are considering at that time. I will save some time unfolding how Dada really affected Ben Patterson, as well as Fluxus interpretations of Dada and their aesthetic interventions, and move through Pets just a little bit more. Notes on Pets. As I said, it was published alongside American Seminar. And American Seminar, too, itself featured a series of prompts and actions or environments for participants to enact. And so Patterson described this type of encounter as a home study situation. And in a newly written text for the performance of American Studies Seminar 2, he stated, quote, "Most psychologists agree that far from being a passive representation of what is there, perception shows itself to be a highly selective effort after meaning, whereby the individual brings upon the information available at his sense organs a cognitive structure determined by his needs, attitudes, and so forth." And so we're going to break that up. He means that people often think about perception as an end result, as what is the output of someone else without understanding the positionality of the onlooker. You might be thinking of the creative act, that no artwork is complete without an audience. Patterson concludes this type of assertion that audience and artists are inextricably linked by emphasizing that education or guiding audiences to the educational value of an object should be tantamount. And so by articulating the function of an artist's work is needed to move beyond meaning, Patterson instead grounds much of the value in how the artist presents his or her perception or their perception to the audience. One of his major attempts at environment building that actually predated Notes on Pets by 3 years is Methods and Processes. I have some images here. And Methods and Processes, it indicates the beginning of his interest in publishing. It's a self-published small pamphlet of event scores paired with found images from magazines and newspapers. It's neither a traditional artist book nor a blind entrepreneurial experiment, right? So Methods and Processes was Patterson's opportunity to lay claim to authorship, to create a channel for negligible personal profit. These were sold for 5 francs, for example, and to establish a consolidated archive of his creative output when he and his then wife, Pure Patterson, moved to Paris. It's a 14-page object with 12 pages of content, essentially, of event scores. And you can see how these parallel each other on each screen. And its physical format is actually quite significant because it simultaneously suggests musical instrumentation, literature, physical engagement above the easy register of just reading and onlooking, if literacy is a non-issue. Bertrand Claves actually noted that Patterson's presentation was unusual because the pages are bound like an accordion. However, this observation is interesting because it directs attention towards the multi-layered functionality of the book. It's not just a literary object or a musical suggestion. Patterson's production really stands as both sculpture, as a performance repertory archive, and as an artist book. And this verticality, you see, demands a different type of physical engagement. When I can move from sharing my screen, I can display just a little bit of what it's like to interact with it. And, Patterson, he approached Methods and Processes as a supplement in his attempt to build a stable career. Its reproducibility then and today ensures the possibility for contemporary artists to build their own methods and processes, or to experience its textual components. As he stated in 1999, Patterson will, quote, freely give permissions for performing rights if contacted. The publication helps him identify his consumer base, while it also allows him to reinforce his aesthetic interests and rights as an artist. Howardina Pindell noted that the book format, especially in the early 60s and throughout the rest of the decade, functioned as an alternative exhibition space for artists, citing Fluxus as one of the major contributors to this approach in art making. And so this is really an apt way of viewing a work such as Methods and Processes, which he suggested was his first attempt to move into the visual. What I went through earlier is actually a counter argument to Patterson that the visual extended to his work prior as well. Living on Rue Juge, or excuse my French, 29, just a few miles from the famed Montparnasse, Patterson provided another example of how his work is impacted by space. We can also think about the accordion style as offering some symbolic value in reference to the accordion as an icon of French cafe life. I have identified some figures throughout if you can look in the bottom left corner and the bottom central and the bottom right, that indicates what he was looking at while he was in Paris. So magazines, order books, fashion magazines, journals, newspapers. We see on the bottom Pope John the 23rd, that good Pope who is known for preaching equality for all. But then what you don't see here, but can see in the document I provided, is Pablo Casals, who Kennedy awarded the 1963 Presidential Medal of Freedom as one of the greatest cellists of all time. So there's an unidentified female fashion figure, a soccer player, and a woman who is working out with a medicine ball. And each of these objects seem to suggest, or each of these reproductions of people also seem to suggest, in ways that are economic, social, and cultural access, right? And so Patterson, he attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. And this actually becomes a contentious reference point for him in his reflections on Fluxus's political efficacy. But by access, what I mean is that he is literally flattening the type of hierarchical valuing that we might associate to people by placing them literally on the same realm. And in the center of the bottom left, you'll also see Jackie Kennedy and her unfortunate fall from a horse that was reproduced in news, conversations, and publications. You guys can buy Methods and Processes if you'd like. It's $5. It's reprintable. This is what I mean by the accordion style. So we have these two pages that flat open out and then extends with some length this way. You saw how it stood up. It doesn't play like an accordion. It's actually quite fragile. There are two short event scores within this that I think might be interesting. Share here. And I'll read them out to you. You can follow along in the document. A point of clarity. So I have provided you guys with facsimiles that he provided in his black and white complete. So the order of the images are not correct to the book as it is printed. But as I am circulating through this, there we go. One of the works that he actually performed this later in life, which is interesting because I've never found an indication of him doing it before. But on the right page, you see this event score. Think of number 6, bark like dog. Think of number 6 twice, stand up. Do not think of number 6, sit down. Think of number 6, bark like a dog. When he re-performed this work, he instructed a person, they would enact the action of that sentence and then move on throughout the rest of the event score. So I'm coming back to the main room with you all. I'd like maybe to get 1 or 2 people who would like to perform this with me. I will facilitate it the same way that Patterson had facilitated it himself, unless somebody wants to assume the creativity of performing it without any kind of conducting direction.
It looks like Nathaniel has volunteered. Thank you, Nathaniel.
Okay, Nathaniel, thank you. Nathaniel, can you turn at least your mic on?
Hello.
Hi. Okay, shall we begin?
Absolutely.
Think of number 6. Bark like dog.
Arf, arf, arf. Arf. Bark, bark, bark.
Think of number 6 twice. Stand up. Do not think of number 6. Sit down. Think of number 6. Bark like dog.
Arf, arf, arf. Bark, bark, arf. Arf, arf.
May I ask you a few questions?
Yes.
What is performing that like?
Very irregular. Very strange.
What do you mean by irregular?
I guess it's this is more related to music, right? But it feels more theatrical. It's very interesting. It's like I'm inhabiting a character of some kind, and I'm doing impulses that I wouldn't necessarily do. Like even the number 6, if I was to write down math or a check or something, and I write down 6, I don't really think about the number, but I'm like thinking of just the number 6 in my mind. It's very, that's something that I feel like is very normal in my everyday life.
What is it like to bark like a dog in public?
Very silly, almost a little humiliating. But in a good way, because we're exploring something, and I'm discovering something new. It's fun. And it's very interesting.
It almost sounds like art is an excuse.
Yes, kind of. I would agree with that.
For a certain set of behaviors. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, let me just say that this is a work that I would not perform. I'm thinking that just based off of my own feelings and emotions tied to the feeling of barking like a dog, especially that type of humiliating comment that comment of humiliation that you referenced, it's something that I'm not willing to be vulnerable with, and we should always, actually, I would say almost always in Ben Patterson's work, understand his influences based off of where he is. So he's in Paris and he's hearing the number 6 million over and over and over and over again. 6 million is this figure that has been repeated as the number of Jewish people and disabled people and people outside of the Aryan ideal of whiteness were killed. Yeah, right. And so I'm thinking that for Ben, he was very well aware, culling these images from newspapers of this kind of discourse and being conscripted, which I did not share, but he was conscripted into the U.S. Army's typing pool in the 7th Army Symphony Orchestra, a country that did not offer him any opportunities. Barking itself, this type of animality and violence that comes with war, it really just calls forth so many different ideas and impressions and meaning. And I think that's actually one of the strengths of his work. And so
Julia, a question?
Nathaniel. Yes.
Could you explain, my phone is small, so on the page of the accordion where he has the score, next to it are images. Could you explain a little bit of just the construction of the accordion of the book? So there, could you there are images near the instructions, right?
Yeah. So can you at least see my camera just a little bit?
Yeah. I was just curious because how do the for that particular one, the one Ben just did, there was a particular image, I think, by it. Okay. Could you say something about your thoughts on how the images work next to the to the instructions?
I do think that for the most of the event scores in this book, the image and the text establish certain types of meaningful tensions. And so when we look at this work, for example, what I essentially requested of Nathaniel was to enact several very commanding, regimented actions. But then we have this free-flowing body that is also moving to show some type of prowess, some type of success, some sort of capability of what the human body can do for sports. And there's another work that sometimes they haven't made sense to me, to be quite honest. And I think that is some of the loss that happens in esoteric moments in Patterson's work. But the other piece that I was going to have you guys look at or ask somebody to perform with me is one related to a mirror. I know that your camera's off and you don't have to turn it on, Jim Rush, but would you be willing to perform this one?
Sure.
Okay, so you scroll down in that document, scroll down to...
It was hard for me to download the document. Maybe if you could pop it up, just...
Yes.
Right, so just from the pieces we've done, there's a lot to be garnered from it. Just if you could say something later about just the form of his work and maybe some of the other Fluxus people in terms of all the stuff that's packed into the book.
Mm-hmm. So can you see let's table that for the general Q&A. I believe we'll have time. Chris, you'll have to tell me after I finish this if we don't have time.
I can't see. The text is so tiny. I can't read it.
Then let me read it to you. It's the top right stanza, essentially, next to the woman who is in this picnic fitness ad or whatever. I have not been able to identify her. It says, "Sit before mirror in dark room. Make pleasant face. Make angry face. Make perplexed face. Make indifferent face. Stop. Imagine expression of no face." And that's it. I'm going to ask you about your experience performing that work.
Sure.
Sort of the Q&A, if we can.
I'm sorry, say it again?
I'm going to ask you questions about the performance of that during the general Q&A.
Oh, sure.
I have one thing that I would like to get through, and I can totally truncate it. I wrote way too much for the presentation. Because we're going to do paper piece at the end, and I'm hoping that everybody who would like to present paper piece can at least turn on their camera and their audio for this work. And thank you for presenting that. Thank you, Nathaniel, and thank you, Jim Rush. Let's see. You know, Patterson's work is a very interesting encounter. It really, really is. Okay. So I'm going to move on. Five performers, 15 sheets of paper each. Quality varied: newspaper, tissue paper, heavy drawing paper, light cardboard, colored, painted, or plain. Dry: 3 paper bags each, quality, size, shaped, varied. Duration: preferably not more than 12 minutes and not less than 10. Procedure: each performer may begin at any opportune moment after a general signal from the chairman. This piece will end when the total paper supply has been exhausted. Let's go further down this event score. 3 sheets will be performed: rub, scrub, twist. The paper is twisted slightly until a squeaking sound is produced, approximately 30 seconds per sheet. 3 bags will be performed: poof, pop, inflate with the mouth. Previously, each performer will have independently selected and arranged his own materials in sequence of events. It is advisable to mark the method of performance on each sheet. Dynamics: dynamics should be carefully improvised with the material borders of the approximate FFF of the pop and the PPP of the twist. Kern, August 1960. This is Patterson's event score for Paper Piece, created while he lived in modest and poor conditions in a small flat in Cologne, Germany, a city decimated by bombing in World War II. Cologne was duly important for Patterson because of its rough surroundings, its brick rubble, its detritus. Thinking through his growing interest in aleatory or chance music, he was really interested in the abundance of paper materials common to the everyday experience and paper's potential acoustic properties. Its form, once again, was negligible. I have several other versions of this work that you guys can see in this presentation, and I should make it larger, excuse me. He encouraged everyone to perform Paper Piece by ripping apart paper. The first was an audience of his parents, and the second were those who would read it in Ich bin schön, and then the further would be those who attended events. Paper Piece, you know, his parents actually, sidebar, very quick sidebar, his parents were trained musicians, and in fact, the work remains in contact in the Gilbert and Leela Silverman collection at the Museum of Modern Art. There's also a deeper history to Paper Piece, that he was provoked by his surroundings and by the people who were participating in it. So outside of these aesthetic and oral concerns, Patterson was responding to Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's 300 hours long rehearsals for a work called Contacta. Patterson was inspired to create something that required little preparation and something that was performable by the skilled and unskilled. And so, in fact, perhaps my presentation of the situation is a bit of an understatement. Patterson's creation of Paper Piece derived from a deeply personal sense of dissatisfaction with concurrent presentations of new music. He was inspired towards simplicity, right? And so here I would have dedicated some time talking about how Patterson is blending the conceptual and the performative by using this upturned ledger that would generally hold music lines, but also using his own handwritten words and comments to merge language with sound. I would tell you that it took me some time myself as someone untrained in music to understand fortissimo, for example, which is the lightness or the loudness of a sound that he expects you to occur. But there's some important tension here. Even in this free choice that he allows of the performer, there's also some control that happens. He requests actions with quite a degree of specificity, such as holding a specific number of paper while simultaneously estimating proportional mathematics. He asks you to reduce specific sheets of paper by 1/10 of their original size repeatedly within 1 minute, right? So there's this suggestion of the impossible gesture, but participating nevertheless. And I have an image that shows you another iteration of Paper Piece that were performed by others. In fact, he is so inviting of information and meaning created by others, that when Paper Peace was performed in 1963 by some other participants, where they ripped to shreds one of George Maciunis's manifestos that claimed one should purge the world of Europeanism, for example, it began to accrue a very, very political context in response to self-agency and self-resistance, denying one's external influences from another person's ideologies. And actually, this is where I'm going to drop the presentation, because I would like for us all to perform variations for double bass. I would like to honor his wishes, actually, to spend about 10 minutes doing it. It tends to be a fun work. It's one of the most iconic Fluxus repertory event scores. Generally, it introduces and concludes performances. I'll give you guys about 2 minutes to assemble your paper products. And in my experience of encountering his work, the precision of following the directions is imprecise. The goal is to rip the paper. Rip the paper, toss the paper, blow the paper, pop the paper. Okay? Because I was prepared for this, have a number of materials. And at 1:37, I will ask you to unmute and reveal yourself, or what you would like to reveal on camera, so we can end a very general run through of Ben Patterson and the interesting encounters of what it actually means and feels like to perform his work, and then move on into a general Q&A so I can address some of your questions. So you have till 1:37. If you need any inspiration, I thought I should rip up methods and processes, but I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to tell you what I'm ripping up, but I'm going to rip some stuff up. Maybe you want to rip up bills or spam. Maybe you want to rip up that paper that you're like, oh God, I just wrote this. Maybe you want to rip up envelopes. I'm not popping any bags. What you would generally experience if you saw Patterson performing Paper Peace is people would enter a space from the side of a room, either get on top of a platform or a stage, and he would give a conductor signal to perform Paper Peace. I'll check in with you guys in about 1 minute. If anybody wants to ask a question in the interim, please don't hesitate to do so.
Where can you purchase the methods processes?
You can purchase it from, my French is really bad, but Les Presse du Real. So LES, and then PRESSE, and DUREEL. Thank you. Are we ready? I will begin when I see unmuted mics for everybody who's presenting. Okay. Let's do this for 10 minutes. Let's start. One more minute. And conclude. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, good job, everybody.
The detritus that lies right in front of us. I think because there's so many questions that I expect, we can just hop right into the Q&A. I did want to ask Jim Rush about his experience performing that mirror piece in the darkness, about Ben's work. Performance art is so interesting because sometimes the act of performance, like literally trying to embody the work, is less of a spectacle than one might have imagined. And some of Patterson's works also render strange, normal objects. I have performed paper piece before, but not with that many materials, and generally it becomes this very fun group enactment where everybody's playing around like it's a playpen paper, but it's different. It's really different. I think sometimes that different or difference is what causes some difficulty understanding or encountering his work. So you can just hop into a Q&A. You can ask me anything you would like about Ben Patterson or any of the ideas I might have quickly tossed out during the lecture portion.
Sure. Do you want me to start with that experience?
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun. Just enabled me quickly to go into like being a child again, like acting, which I haven't done that much of. Made me think about like when I'm going to say the word women, but it doesn't have to be women, put on makeup, like kind of that preparation. Also, for me, I like seeing smiles, and like putting my face in the shape of a smile is a happy experience. I guess some people have kind of talked about that idea. So those were a few of the things that came to mind. If you had any questions.
Yeah, what was it like doing that all in the dark?
Yeah, so I did it in the dark by closing my eyes and keep them closed instead of turning light switches off. So that was fun. In contrast to what I was saying, like where I was trying to figure out, am I going to go in the street, and the other one with the light, and ended up whatever. So it was just closing my eyes and turning the light off in my mind, kind of showing us, the power of the imagination.
Yeah, I that's actually a really interesting way of approaching it. Literally closing your eyes and having some darkness unfold around you. Yeah, and I also actually appreciate hearing that, because the works are so variable. They are so variable. No single performance of Patterson's work ever is the same.
Just one thing about it, just so the time travel, I really like how it gave me permission to be a child so quickly, so that can help me when I want to do certain things creatively and whatnot. So just it was amazing how fast, with all the distractions around in the world today, that I was able to do that. So that was empowering.
You know, he held very commanding presences on stages. He was a very good conductor of work, always kept a straight face. So I can imagine, just from your experience, that had he also conducted that piece for you, it might have also generated other experiences. Thank you for performing it.
Sure.
I have a sort of a biographical question about Ben for you, Julia. Can you tell us a little bit about why he spent some of his formative artistic years in Germany, and what kind of, as far as it's like possible to ascertain and like untease it, like what kind of influence did that have, like German, like West Germany at the time, have on his development as an artist?
Mm-hmm. So generally the narrative unfolds about Penn is that he ended up in Germany accidentally. He ended up working as lead double bassist at the Halifax Symphony Orchestra in Canada because he could not obtain a principal position in the United States during an era of segregation. And he has a story where he had debuted for hours and hours only to hear that he could not make it because he was Black. And by the time he was in Canada, he was already interested in emerging worlds of electronic music. And so to him, going to Germany would have been the place. Germany was the leading country at the time for tape music, electronic music. We think about perhaps Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, but also the Ferienkurse in Darmstadt brought a lot of international musicians to the area to conduct work, to experiment with one another. And upon one of his visits to Germany, there was a strike at the symphony orchestra in Canada, and he just decided to stay. He didn't return, and there are some happenstance situations that happened, such as him saying he saw a flyer on the ground advertising a counter festival at Mary Bauermeister's studio. Germany, I had previously argued, was the site of his own birth as an artist, but now that I've been privileged with the time of more access to archives, that happens even earlier before that time, but Germany was really a central place. He was there for about 2 years, moved to Paris, not expecting to move back to Germany. And it was also this interesting side of Germany was also this interesting side of international creatives more broadly, because you have the US, among other countries, occupying Germany in the process of attempting to revitalize it and protect their claims of democratic world orientation against the communists. And so there was an influx of money, an influx of people, and Patterson was there, and he was also embraced, an experience he has described as unusual given that sense of rejection in the United States.
I have a question. It's interesting, his connection. I mean, obviously the connection to music is like prominent. And the connection also to Germany is interesting, because I'm curious if he had any opinions of like a more, like more contemporary electronic music, or how that affected in terms of, I'm just thinking in the sense of like the experience of going out to dance and experiencing like, that idea from this kind of angle. I don't know if that's even forming a full question, but it's just like basically this whole talk has inspired a lot of connections that I'm still trying to like figure out, but yeah.
Well, when he moved back to the US, he placed himself in many situations where he could help integrationist efforts to get Black classical musicians into integrated symphonies and into integrated spaces. I'm saying this because he ended up returning to Germany at the end of the 80s into the early 90s and has his Aufenthaltstitel. What is that in English? Residence. He has his ID card that allows him to be in Germany for some time. He has a daughter named Barbara, who I have worked with over the years with the estate, who was also in Germany. But when he came back, he was in his own band. He was in a band with other people. I hope that type of energy and activity and openness of myself when I age. And many of these figures were also those who followed experimental music development in Germany, and those who have spent many, many hours and days thinking through Cagean ideas of indeterminacy and aleatoric music and so forth. There's this interesting work where Patterson, this isn't electronic music. This is sort of representative of the span of his interest. He is in graffiti piece, he is spraying air canisters in the air, dancing and bopping to Eminem. You know, Patterson, so to say it in a shorter way, although Patterson had freedom throughout the different media he explored, he had some very serious critiques about the gaze of Black male musicians. So it wasn't lost on him that when he was in Germany, that there was a potential gaze of him of being a Black jazz musician. So if we think about something like Variations for Double Bass, where he's doing pizzicato, which is plucking on the strings, or when he's slamming his hands, he's also calling forth some imagery that Germans found unique to American music. In fact, Germans saw American Negro spirituals as the original American music. Whatever white immigrants to the country had produced was derivative of their own. So, you know, that's probably layering a lot onto your question, but he was definitely a person who was very interested in new things. He was interested in innovation and what that could do in your daily life. In fact, in the archives, I saw that he was researching memes of all things. And I just learned memes through Legacy Russell's presentation with Discrit. So he was really involving himself in a lot of different sensorial experiences.
I was just going to add, because I mean, my initial question made me think of like techno, right? And like that history. So it's just interesting to think about how it was appropriated in Germany. But then, so just trying to place those like connections and figure out the idea of like boundlessness in a way. Or I guess the opposite, like boundaries.
It's like anything can mean everything. How does one navigate that? Before we leave, I finally have a chance to focus on the chat, and I want to make sure that I'm not missing any comments that somebody might have made. Bump them in the event that I'm looking at them.
No questions in there.
Okay.
Maggie just mentioned that was a really cool connection to the exploration of memes.
Yeah.
Melanie says, thank you so much for this informative lecture and experience. Ditto, twofold. Look forward to the development of the project. Bravo, Julia.
Well, thank you, Melanie. Well,
can you mention?
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, could you mention like the actual, like the book coming out, right?
Dissertation. My life has had to move with some care and peace and self-care, and so it's going to be a dissertation, and the book project, however that is formed, will manifest itself in this balance of life and dissertating and pandemic and so.
I'm very proud of you, friend. You did a great job.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I was saying very proud of you, friend. You did a great job.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that was really wonderful, Julia. Thank you so much for all of the effort that you put into that. And I just felt like you really delicately like held our hands through this really cool exploration. And it was super easy to follow and really informative and very cool to workshop this stuff with you guys and to kind of play and experiment and take some risks together.
Thank you guys, because when I've always had anxiety about performing his work. But I knew I needed to do it. And to me, the openness of his work was so bizarre. So it was very, very good to do this with a group, especially on Zoom, that is a little bit more low stakes than doing it on an auditorium stage.
Yeah.
So thank you for the opportunity. You guys will be acknowledged in my dissertation acknowledgements. Seriously, thank you. It's an important platform.
You're very welcome. Well, I think we might call it. Julia, I want you to like take the rest of the day off. You've done so much. And also I want to do a little quick shout out to Emma again, who this was like the most technically involved Zoom that we've ever done. So I really want to thank you for rolling with the punches, and Joey too.
Thank you so much.
For real.
Of course, thank you guys for bringing such a wonderful, just fun idea to us. It's always nice to try something a little bit different.
Yeah, more of this to come, I think.
Please.
Yes. All right. Well, we'll call it there. Thank you guys so much. Everyone have a wonderful day.
Yeah, just a reminder for everyone. Thank you, Julia. This event is recorded. It will go up on the Atlanta Contemporary YouTube page if you want to revisit or share with anybody. So you can find us there, as well as at atlantacontemporary.org. Julia, I don't know if you have a website or anything that you would like to share.
I have a website that needs to be updated. It's neal, nealje.com. I am on Twitter. I am a ghost on Instagram, but you can find me on Twitter at artsistorian. Yes, that's my user handle. And then Instagram, it's JJENEAL, but don't expect me to be on it.
Just a ghost in the shell on that one.
Yeah. It's been so difficult, like juggling social medias, and I admit that I just can't do it. Well, you guys take care.
All right. See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for participating.